Nestled in a quiet cul-de-sac just beyond the edge of the city, Mark Alden had finally found the life he'd worked for. After 20 years of grinding through law school, billable hours, and courtroom battles, he had settled into a modest, well-kept home with a wraparound porch and a garden he actually had time to tend. The kind of place where mornings started with coffee and birdsong, and evenings melted into sunsets behind rows of neatly trimmed hedges. It wasn't flashy, but it was his. The neighborhood ran like a well-oiled machine, sometimes too well, thanks to the HOA. But for the most part, Mark had no complaints. He paid his dues, kept his lawn to code, and mostly ignored the monthly newsletters stuffed with passive-aggressive reminders. There was a mutual understanding between him and the HOA. They stayed out of his way, and he stayed out of theirs. That balance cracked one Thursday morning with the low, mechanical growl of an excavator. Mark stepped onto his porch in pajama, pants and a robe, coffee in hand, blinking in confusion as two men in neon vests and hard hats stomped across his lawn. Without so much as a knock or a heads-up, they'd already cordoned off a 10-foot section of his yard and were unloading gear like it belonged to them. "Hey, what's going on here?" Mark called out, walking barefoot across the dewy grass. One of the workers barely looked up from his clipboard. "Fiber optic line install. Shouldn't take more than a couple days." "In my yard?" Mark asked, heart already ticking faster. "Yeah, HOA approval," the guy said, like it was a full explanation. "Everything's cleared." The words sank in slowly, heavy with implication. Mark hadn't received a notice, an email, not even one of those smug little HOA flyers about this. And now they were digging up the very ground where he'd planted his wife's rose bushes last spring. He felt a knot twist in his stomach. Not just anger, but the deeper kind of unease that comes when you realize someone has crossed a line you didn't even know they were near. He walked back inside and set his coffee down, hands trembling just enough to spill a drop. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the way the workers avoided eye contact, in the way the trucks parked just slightly askew on the sidewalk, in the too casual mention of HOA approval. Mark wasn't just a homeowner. He was a lawyer. And lawyers knew when someone was bluffing. By noon, the digging had begun in earnest. Bright orange flags dotted the lawn like an invasion force, and mounds of dirt piled up on the edge of his garden bed. Mark watched from the kitchen window, jaw tight. The piece he'd built here, bit by bit, year after year, was being torn apart by men who wouldn't even tell him their last names. Later that afternoon, he called the HOA office, and after 3 redirects and a cheerful hold music loop, he finally got a woman named Sharon on the line. "Oh yes," she chirped. "It's part of the community-wide upgrade. We sent out a notice in the February newsletter." Mark didn't bother to hide the sarcasm in his voice. "You mean the one filled with landscaping tips and a cartoon about leash laws?" "Well, it was included," she said curtly. "And the board approved the installation last quarter. But not on my property," Mark shot back. Silence. That silence told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't an upgrade. It was a violation. And Mark had just gone from peaceful retiree to reluctant investigator. The line had been crossed. Now it was time to find out just how deep it ran. Hey, real quick. If you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment, and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. Mark stood on his front lawn, arms crossed, watching the workers dig like they were mining gold beneath his grass. The once even stretch of green was now a mess of tire ruts, mud, and broken roots. He had asked them to stop, politely at first, then firmly. Each time they gave him the same response: "We're just following orders." But orders from whom? That question led him to the HOA office the next morning. It was a beige building tucked between a strip mall and a dog grooming salon. Unassuming, almost forgettable, but it held the power to disrupt people's lives in ways that were anything but small. The inside smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and printed paper. A receptionist offered him a too bright smile before disappearing to fetch someone from the board. A few minutes later, he found himself sitting across from a man named Craig something, maybe Sanders or Sanderson, whose business card proudly declared him HOA vice president, like it was a government position. Craig had the polished look of someone who ironed his jeans and wore cologne to the mailbox. "I understand your concern," Craig said, with the kind of voice that usually came after a flight delay announcement. "But everything is above board. The community voted to approve the installation back in February. The board handled the logistics." Mark leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "You're digging on my property. Not the sidewalk, not a shared alley, my yard." "And I never consented." Craig gave a casual shrug, like that detail didn't matter. "Per our bylaws, we have easement rights for utility access." That made Mark pause. He knew easement law well, enough to recognize when someone was bluffing. It wasn't just the words. Craig said it like a script, not like someone who understood the implications. Still, Mark didn't want to argue without proof, so he left the office, not satisfied, but armed with determination. That night he sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by old HOA documents, bylaws, and property maps. The house was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional sip of now-cold coffee. He flipped through the pages line by line, highlighting, cross-referencing, digging into the language like he would for a deposition. And then he found it. Small but important detail buried deep in the easement clause. It stated that the HOA retained rights for maintenance of pre-existing utility lines and approved shared access pathways. But there was no language granting them permission to install new infrastructure on private property without explicit written homeowner consent. His breath caught for a moment. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't overreacting. They were in the wrong, but what could he do about it? Out there in the yard, under the cover of night, the trenches lay open like fresh wounds. The fiber optic cable, thick and unfamiliar, snaked through the dirt like a parasite burrowing into his home. Tomorrow they'd bury it, patch the lawn, and move on like nothing ever happened. He'd be left with the scars and a sinking sense that his voice didn't matter in a neighborhood that liked to call itself a community. A flicker of helplessness settled in his chest. It was a foreign feeling for someone like Mark, someone who'd built a career on control, logic, and legal footing. But now he was standing on his own grass, watching strangers violate his space, while the very organization meant to protect neighborhood harmony treated him like a footnote. He closed the binder slowly, the paper edges brushing against his fingertips like sandpaper. No matter how nice the neighborhood looked on the outside, this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was a breach of trust, of rights, and of privacy. The next morning, when the workers returned to finish burying the cable, Mark didn't say a word. He just stood by his porch with a notepad in hand, documenting everything: times, names, conversations. If the HOA wanted to pretend the rules didn't apply to them, he'd show them exactly what happens when you break the law on a lawyer's lawn. The game had changed, and Mark was just getting started. It didn't take long for things to go wrong. Just 3 days after the workers had packed up their equipment and driven off without so much as a nod, Mark noticed the first crack. It ran like a thin, jagged vein along the edge of his front walkway. Small enough to miss at first glance, but definitely new. By the end of the week, it had widened, creeping toward the front steps like something alive. He crouched beside it, fingertips brushing the surface. The ground felt uneven, almost sunken in places, off balance. Then came the sprinkler system. One morning he stepped outside and found his yard soaked, with muddy puddles pooling in places that had never collected water before. When he checked the controller, it was flashing an error code. He opened the valve box, and what he saw made his stomach turn. A crushed PVC pipe snapped clean in half, right where the trench had been dug. Coincidence? Maybe. But Mark didn't believe in coincidence. Not when it came to carelessly buried infrastructure and indifferent authority figures. The final straw came that weekend. His internet began dropping in and out. Not the HOA's shiny new fiber line, which he'd refused to connect to, but his own reliable service. Every time it cut out, he'd lose access to his security cameras, streaming, even basic work functions. The irony stung. They had destroyed his yard and still managed to interfere with his network. Mark dialed the HOA's office again, this time not bothering to hide the frustration in his voice. Sharon, the same chirpy woman from before, answered like she was handling a call about misplaced recycling bins. "There's damage," Mark told her plainly. "To my sprinklers, my walkway, possibly my own data line. Your contractors caused this." Sharon's tone stayed infuriatingly light. "Oh no, Mr. Alden, our installation team is professionally vetted. If there was any pre-existing wear and tear, that's not something we can be held responsible for." "Pre-existing?" he repeated, stunned. "Are you seriously suggesting this was already broken before your guys showed up?" "I'm not suggesting anything," she replied smoothly. "Just stating what's in the report." Mark was quiet, for a long moment. Then he said, "Email me the report." "Of course," she said, as if she were doing him a favor. When the document arrived, it was laughably thin. 2 pages, generic photos, and a checkbox-style list claiming no damage, found post-installation, no signatures from him, no notes about his property. It was gaslighting, dressed up in polite formatting and HOA letterhead, and Mark had had enough. That night, he walked the perimeter of his yard with a flashlight, stopping every few feet to take pictures. He photographed the crack from multiple angles, recorded the broken sprinkler pipe still dripping water into the soil, logged the exact time and date when his internet failed. Every detail went into a folder on his laptop labeled HOA Damage, Evidence. He wasn't angry anymore, not in the way most people understood anger. It had cooled into something sharper, focused, methodical, like the way he used to prepare for trial. Facts over feelings, proof over protest. The HOA wanted to pretend nothing had happened. They wanted him to be a silent casualty in their upgrade plan. But Mark knew the law, and he knew that even the strongest-sounding lies couldn't survive the truth when it was well documented and delivered at the right moment. They'd cracked more than pavement when they dug up his yard. They'd cracked their own foundation, and Mark was ready to watch it collapse. Mark had spent most of his life in courtrooms, offices, and across negotiation tables, where silence could be weaponized and a single misplaced word could collapse a case. He had worn suits like armor, sharpened, his arguments like blades, and learned to read people the way others read maps. But ever since retiring 2 years ago, he'd let that part of himself drift into the background, like an old suit packed away in the back of a closet. Until now. The HOA had poked the wrong bear. It wasn't just about the broken sprinkler or the deepening crack in his walkway. It wasn't even about the mess they'd left behind. It was about the assumption, the audacity of people who believed he'd roll over because he had gray at his temples and spent mornings gardening instead of cross-examining hostile witnesses. So, one evening, Mark pulled that metaphorical suit back out. He set up his laptop, in the sunroom, his quiet thinking space, and surrounded himself with case law books, folders of his own property records, and printouts of the HOA's charter. The fading daylight slanted across the table in golden strips as the hours ticked by. His reading glasses slid down his nose as he flipped through page after page, pausing now and then to highlight a line or scribble a note in the margin. It didn't take long for his instincts to kick in. The first red flag was the easement claim. The HOA kept parroting the phrase as if it were gospel. "We have utility easement rights." But when Mark pulled up his deed and the plat map of the property, it painted a different story. The easement, clearly marked, stopped 6 feet short of where they had dug. The fiber line wasn't just close to the edge, it cut directly through the middle of his yard. That made it trespassing, plain and simple. The second flag came from the HOA bylaws themselves, which he read line by line as if preparing to cross-examine them. In the section about community projects and infrastructure upgrades, the language required a supermajority vote, one that had to be documented and publicly disclosed to all residents. There had been no such notice, no recorded vote, no official permission. The February newsletter the HOA kept referencing wasn't a legal notification. It was a casual mention buried between pet policies and garden club meeting times. Strike 2, and then came the third. Buried deep in the governing documents, page 43 of the official charter, was a clause requiring written consent from a homeowner if any physical modification to private property was involved, regardless of purpose or community benefit. The wording was dry and clinical, but the meaning was explosive. Mark leaned back in his chair, the weight of vindication settling in. They hadn't just bent the rules, they had snapped them in half and expected no one to notice. A slow smile crept across his face, not of pettiness, but of clarity. The kind that comes when the fog lifts and the path forward becomes obvious. For days he'd felt powerless, like a man watching strangers tear up his home while being told he had no right to stop them. But now, he had the truth. And truth, especially when wielded by someone who knew how to use it, was the most powerful tool in the world. He began drafting a letter that night, formal, sharp, and surgically precise. The kind of letter that made people reread it with a sinking feeling in their stomach. It cited the exact pages of the bylaws, highlighted the boundaries of the easement, and included time-stamped photos of the damage. It was equal parts documentation and warning shot. They thought he was just another retiree with too much time on his hands. What they didn't know was that Mark Alden had once dismantled multi-million-dollar fraud cases with nothing but a legal pad and a closing argument. The power had shifted, quietly, subtly, like the first rumble before an earthquake. And the HOA didn't even feel it yet. The decision wasn't impulsive. It wasn't born of spite or vengeance. It was strategic. Mark waited until the weekend, when the neighborhood slipped into its usual Saturday rhythm. Dog walkers, distant lawn mowers, kids on scooters. To any casual observer, it looked like just another home improvement project. A wheelbarrow leaned against the fence, a few traffic cones cordoned off part of the yard, and a man in dusty coveralls unloaded equipment from a van with no visible company name. The contractor's name was Luis, a quiet, no-questions-asked professional Mark had worked with years ago on a zoning dispute case. Back then, Luis had been a subcontractor with a sharp eye for detail and a deep respect for lines, property lines, utility lines, boundaries of all kinds. Mark trusted him because he didn't ask why. He asked where. They started near the patch of sod that had never quite recovered from the installation. Luis used a ground-penetrating radar unit first, standard for this kind of job. As he swept it over the soil, Mark watched the screen, the black and white static gradually taking shape into a faint, snaking line that cut diagonally through his backyard. It didn't follow the easement. It didn't hug the border. It sliced clean through. His property like it belonged there, but it didn't. Luis started digging. The first few feet were quiet, methodical, just soil and roots. Then came the harder stuff, packed dirt, gravel, and eventually a glint of orange plastic tubing, the kind used for fiber optic protection. Luis paused, brushing dirt away carefully, revealing the line in full. Thick, reinforced, clearly commercial. "Want me to keep going?" Luis asked. Mark nodded. 2 hours later, they had exposed nearly 30 feet of the cable, following its curve like a trail of breadcrumbs. It passed directly beneath his vegetable bed and curved toward the far end of the yard, still on private land. When they reached the fence, Luis pointed to the path it took beyond, toward the HOA's small administrative building 3 houses down, tucked behind a row of manicured hedges. "So, what's the plan?" Luis asked, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. Mark didn't answer right away. He crouched beside the cable, running his hand along the sheath. It buzzed faintly beneath his fingers, alive with data. "This line doesn't legally exist here," Mark said quietly, "which means it has no protection under the law." Luis gave him a look, half caution, half curiosity. Mark didn't need anyone's permission. He retrieved a set of insulated cable shears from the garage, tools he had kept for home repairs but never used for anything like this. Luis stepped aside as Mark crouched again, positioning the blades around the thick fiber housing. For a moment, the silence deepened. There was no drama, no grand music. Just the sound of birds in the trees and a neighbor's hose running somewhere down the street, and then, snip, the cable severed cleanly. A few sparks danced in the air before fading into the dirt. The buzz went silent. Luis whistled under his breath. "Well, that'll get someone's attention." Mark stood up, brushing dust from his knees. "That's the idea." Later that afternoon, the neighborhood Facebook group lit up. Residents near the HOA office were complaining about the Wi-Fi being down. "Total blackout," someone wrote. "HOA says it's a technical issue. They're calling the installers." Mark sipped his tea on the porch, calm, composed. He hadn't caused the problem. He had simply removed a trespassing utility that was never supposed to be there in the first place. And he had the documents to prove it. Let them scramble. Let them wonder. He hadn't filed the lawsuit yet. That was coming. But this was a quiet warning. The kind they wouldn't see coming until it was far too late to do anything but panic. They'd buried their line across the wrong man's yard, and now they'd feel exactly what it meant to cross a lawyer who knew both the law and where to dig. The storm hit early Monday morning. It started with a voicemail, sharp, indignant, and just vague enough to be deniable in court. Sharon's syrupy voice had lost its smoothness, replaced by clipped words and a simmering panic she could barely conceal. "Mr. Alden, we've received reports of, unauthorized interference with HOA-managed infrastructure on your property. This is a serious matter. We need to speak immediately before this escalates further." Mark paused the message halfway through. The phrase unauthorized interference made him laugh, short and dry. He replayed it, then saved the file to his HOA correspondence folder. The tone told him everything he needed to know. They'd lost connectivity at the HOA office and traced it back to the severed line, but they hadn't expected the man responsible to be waiting for them, documents in hand and gloves already off. By noon, the emails started. Official-looking headers, bolded threats, and phrases like property violation, community impact, and pending fine assessment. They accused him of sabotage, claimed he'd disrupted essential service, warned of immediate penalties. Mark didn't respond. Instead, he printed every message, clipped them neatly into a binder, and reviewed each one over lunch like he was preparing for court. Which, in a way, he was. When the knock finally came, it wasn't subtle. Heavy and urgent, like someone trying to establish dominance with their knuckles. Mark opened the door to find 2 members of the HOA board standing on his porch, one red-faced with frustration, the other clearly trying to play mediator. "We need to talk about what you did," said the red-faced one, skipping pleasantries. "You've destroyed community infrastructure and—" "I didn't destroy anything," Mark said calmly, stepping aside just enough to frame the doorway, but not enough to invite them in. "I removed unauthorized equipment that was trespassing on my property. There's a legal difference. Would you like me to explain it?" The 2 board members exchanged a glance. The second man, the one with the cooler head, cleared his throat. "Mr. Alden, look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. We're just trying to make improvements for everyone. The fiber line was installed without a vote, a permit, or my consent," Mark cut in. "It crosses private property outside the recorded easement. I've reviewed the subdivision plat, the HOA charter, and the bylaws. You're in violation of at least 3 provisions. I've also filed a complaint with the county zoning office and the Public Utility Commission." Silence. Mark let it hang there a moment, watching them shift uncomfortably. "I have documentation," he continued. "Photos, time-stamped video of your contractors, a detailed legal report. If you attempt to fine me, I will counter with a civil suit for property damage, trespassing, and unlawful utility installation." The first man opened his mouth, then shut it again. The second gave a shallow nod, eyes flicking to the street like he suddenly needed to be anywhere but there. Without another word, they turned and walked down the driveway. Mark watched them go, heart steady. No adrenaline this time, just the cool calm of knowing he had the upper hand. The moment the line was cut, they'd assumed he'd panic, that he'd flinch. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who'd cross-examined hostile witnesses and dismantled corporate fraud. Schemes with nothing but a paper trail and patience. Let them bluster. Let them threaten. They weren't in control anymore. They'd started a battle they weren't prepared to finish, and Mark Alden was just getting started. News, like water, has a way of seeping through cracks. Slow at first, almost imperceptible, until, suddenly, everything is soaked in it. A week after Mark had severed the illegal cable and calmly dismantled the HOA's threats, the neighborhood buzz shifted from whispers about outages to murmurs of something deeper, something rotten. Mark hadn't intended to uncover more than a simple zoning violation, but in reviewing the chain of communication, he'd come across something off. The permit number referenced in one of the HOA's emails didn't match any filed with the county. Mark, methodical as ever, placed a quiet call to the zoning office. The clerk on the other end was polite but confused. There was no permit filed for fiber installation. None approved. Not even a request on record. That was the moment Mark felt. The click. Like a puzzle piece sliding into place. It wasn't just an oversight. It was a cover-up. Over the next few days, he dug deeper. Records requests, cross-checks, a few discreet phone calls. And then, the twist came. Not as a thunderclap, but as a quiet bombshell dropped in a PDF he almost missed. A payment log. A company called Blue Grid Communications had submitted a fiber installation invoice, signed not by the board, not by the treasurer, but solely by Sharon Wilkins, the HOA president. The same Sharon who'd left him that voice message. The same Sharon who'd waved off his complaints with faux politeness and veiled threats. Mark leaned back in his chair, heart beating faster, eyes scanning the details. The invoice included a consulting fee, paid out separately, to a private LLC registered under Sharon's maiden name. Kickbacks. She hadn't just bypassed board protocol. She'd monetized the disruption, sacrificed resident trust, bulldozed private property, and risked lawsuits all for personal gain. And Mark now had the receipts. He didn't go public at first. He went surgical. He printed the documents, bound them into a slim packet, and delivered it, quietly, to the homes of each board member. No fanfare, no confrontation, just facts. By Friday, the neighborhood group chat was on fire. Residents were demanding emergency meetings. Board members were resigning. And Sharon, once the unshakable face of the HOA, was nowhere to be found. It was poetic in a way. The same people who had rolled their eyes at Mark when he raised concerns were now knocking on his door, thanking him, apologizing, asking what came next. One neighbor brought over a pie. Another asked if he'd consider running for the board. Mark politely declined both. He hadn't done it for power or recognition. He'd done it because the law mattered, because no one, not even a self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, was above accountability. When Sharon finally surfaced, it was in an email, brief, brittle, and full of forced grace. She announced her resignation, citing health reasons and a desire to focus on personal matters. There was no mention of the kickbacks, no acknowledgement of the buried line or the property damage. But it didn't matter. The truth was, already out. Mark stood at his window that evening watching as a new contractor crew carefully removed the rest of the illegal cable from his yard. This time, with permission. This time, with apologies. The air smelled of spring again, fresh-cut grass and warm soil. Justice, he realized, didn't always come with flashing lights or gavel strikes. Sometimes it came with a shovel, a camera, and the quiet certainty of knowing where to look and how to make people listen. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.